The Hall of Eternal Night had witnessed 1,000 executions, but never a betrayal quite like this. Celine stood in the center of the crumbling Gothic chamber, her silver-black hair cascading like a waterfall of moonlight and shadow across her pale shoulders. The ancient stone pillars around her bore the scars of centuries, cracks that spiderwebbed through marble, crimson banners torn and faded, their golden embroidery barely visible in the dim light. Above, the vaulted ceiling disappeared into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the very concept of hope. She could feel their eyes on her. The Council of Elders. 7 shadows arranged in a perfect semicircle, their faces hidden beneath hoods the color of dried blood. They sat motionless on their obsidian thrones, silent as death itself, radiating an authority that had crushed rebellions and ended dynasties. The weight of their collective power pressed against her like a physical force, making the air itself difficult to breathe. But Celine did not bow. Behind her, she heard him struggle to his feet. Kel, the human. The man who had somehow, impossibly, become the axis upon which her entire world now turned. She could smell his blood, sweet and warm and achingly mortal, seeping through the makeshift bandages she'd wrapped around his wounds. He'd taken 3 crossbow bolts meant for her during the ambush in the lower city. 3 bolts, and he'd still managed to drag himself here, to the very heart of vampire sovereignty, knowing what awaited them both. Celine Nightborn. The voice came from the central throne, deep and ancient as stone grinding against stone. Elder Marius. The lawkeeper. His hood shifted slightly, and she caught a glimpse of eyes that glowed like embers in a dying fire. You stand accused of treason against the Crimson Covenant. You have harbored a human within our sacred walls. You have shared knowledge forbidden to mortals. You have, he paused and she could hear the disgust dripping from his words, formed an attachment. The word hung in the air like a curse. Attachment. Such a small, inadequate word for what she felt. For the way her heart, a heart that should have been cold and still, thundered in her chest whenever Cale smiled. For the way his voice could soothe the beast that lurked beneath her skin, the hunger that had defined her existence for 2 centuries. For the way she would burn this entire hall to ash if it meant keeping him safe. He is no threat to us, Celine said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. Her crimson eyes swept across the council, meeting each shadowed gaze without flinching. Cale has done nothing but exist. Elder Marius interrupted, his tone final as a tomb ceiling shut. His existence is the threat, child. You know our laws. You were taught them from the moment you first tasted blood. Humans are cattle. Food. Tools to be used and discarded. They are not to be loved. Times change, Celine countered, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She could feel her power rising, the ancient magic that flowed through her bloodline beginning to stir. The air around her shimmered with crimson light, and her enormous wings, leathery and powerful, spanning nearly 12 feet when fully extended, twitched with barely suppressed rage. The world beyond these walls has evolved. Humans have. Silence. The command came from Elder Cassandra, her voice sharp as broken glass. The female elder leaned forward, and Celine caught a glimpse of a face that might have been beautiful once, before centuries of feeding and dark magic had transformed it into something predatory and terrible. You dare lecture us on the nature of humanity? We who walked among them when they cowered in caves? We who shaped their civilizations and toppled their empires? Celine felt Cale's hand touch her shoulder, a gentle, steadying pressure. She wanted to turn to him to memorize his face one more time, but she couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. I know what humans are capable of, she said quietly, and there was steel beneath the softness. I know their cruelty and their compassion, their weakness and their strength. And I know that Cale is worth more than every soul in this room combined. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the broken windows seemed to hold its breath. Then Elder Marius stood. It was a slow, deliberate movement, and as he rose, the temperature in the hall plummeted. Frost began to form on the stone floor, spreading outward in delicate patterns that looked disturbingly like screaming faces. His hood fell back, revealing a face that belonged in nightmares, angular and sharp, with skin like parchment stretched over ancient bone. His eyes blazed with cold fury. You have forgotten yourself, Celine Nightborn, he said, and each word fell like a hammer blow. You have forgotten your place, your duty, your nature. He raised one skeletal hand, and the shadows in the hall began to move, slithering across the floor like living things. The sentence is death. For you both. No. The word came from behind her. Not from Celine but from Cale. She spun around, her eyes wide with horror. Cale, don't. But he was already stepping forward, moving past her with that quiet determination she'd come to recognize. His face was pale from blood loss and pain-etched lines around his mouth, but his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had somehow seen past her monster to the woman beneath, burned with fierce resolve. You want to know why she defends me? Cale said, his voice growing stronger with each word. You want to know what makes me different from every other human you've slaughtered and fed upon for centuries? Elder Marius tilted his head, regarding Cale the way a scholar might examine an interesting insect. Enlighten us, mortal. Cale reached up and pulled aside his blood-stained collar, revealing his throat. But it wasn't the vulnerability of the gesture that made the council lean forward. It wasn't the pulse that beat visibly beneath his skin. It was the mark. A symbol etched into his flesh, glowing with soft golden light. Ancient runes that spiraled and interwove in patterns that predated the Crimson Covenant itself. Patterns that predated the vampire's rise to power. Patterns that, according to every history Celine had ever studied, should not exist anymore. Impossible, Elder Cassandra whispered, and for the first time Celine heard fear in her voice. Cale smiled, and there was no humor in it. Not impossible. Just forgotten. He looked directly at Elder Marius, and the ancient vampire actually took a step back. You want to know what I am? I'm your past come back to haunt you. I'm the bloodline you tried to erase. I'm a hunter, direct descendant of the First Covenant, the treaty you broke when you decided humanity was beneath you. The hall erupted into chaos. The revelation hit Celine like a physical blow. Hunter. The word echoed through her mind, dragging with it fragments of half-remembered lessons from her youth. Stories told by her sire before he'd perished in the blood wars. Tales of an ancient time when vampires and humans had coexisted under a sacred agreement, the First Covenant. But those were myths, children's stories. The covenant had been dissolved centuries ago when humanity's ambition grew too great, when they tried to overthrow their vampire protectors. That's what she'd been taught. That's what every vampire believed. Looking at Cale now, at the runes burning on his skin like accusation-made flesh, Celine felt the foundations of her world beginning to crack. You're lying, Elder Marius snarled, but his voice had lost its certainty. The other council members were on their feet now, their composure shattered. The hunter bloodlines were extinguished. We made certain of it. Did you? Cale's voice was steady, but Celine could see the tremor in his hands, the way he swayed slightly on his feet. He was running on willpower and fury now, nothing more. Or did you just murder everyone you could find and tell yourselves the job was complete? My family has survived in secret for 12 generations. Hiding. Running. Preserving the truth that you tried to bury. Elder Cassandra moved with supernatural speed, appearing before Cale in a blur of motion. Her hand shot out, fingers wrapping around his throat, lifting him off the ground. What truth, human? What lies has your pathetic bloodline been whispering in the dark? Cale choked, his feet dangling, but his eyes never left hers. The truth, he gasped, about who broke the covenant. The truth about the Crimson Purge. The truth about what you did to the children. The words hung in the air like a death knell. Celine felt her blood turn to ice. The Crimson Purge. She'd heard whispers of it, fragments of history that the elders refused to discuss. A dark period 300 years ago when the vampire clans had supposedly united against a great human threat. But the details had always been vague, the records sealed away in the deepest vaults. Release him. Celine's voice cut through the tension, cold and sharp as a blade. Power radiated from her now, her wings spreading to their full magnificent span, casting huge shadows across the chamber. Crimson energy crackled around her fists, and her eyes blazed with inhuman intensity. Release him, or I will make you regret the day you were turned. Cassandra laughed, a sound like breaking bones. You threaten me, child? You who have barely seen 2 centuries. I was ancient when your sire was still mortal. I have drunk the blood of kings and bathed in the tears of nations. You are nothing. Then why are you afraid? Celine took a step forward and the stone beneath her feet cracked. Why do all of you suddenly look like you've seen a ghost? Because they had. That's what Kale represented, a ghost from a past they tried to bury. Evidence of a crime so heinous that even immortals feared its discovery. Enough. Elder Marius slammed his staff against the ground, and the sound reverberated through the chamber like thunder. You want the truth, Celine Nightborn? Very well. Let me educate you on the price of mercy. He gestured, and the air before them shimmered. Images began to form, memories pulled from his ancient mind and projected for all to see. Celine watched in horror as history unfolded before her eyes. She saw the first covenant in its glory, vampires and humans working together, a symbiotic relationship built on mutual benefit. Vampires provided protection from the supernatural threats that plagued the mortal world. Demons, wraiths, feral beasts from beyond the veil. In exchange, humans offered blood freely given, ceremonies of willing sacrifice that sustained vampire kind without death or suffering. It had been paradise. For nearly 1,000 years the alliance had held strong. Then she saw what changed. A new generation of vampires rose to power, those who had never known true hunger, never experienced the gratitude of humans they protected. They looked at the blood offerings and saw weakness. They looked at human cities and saw food. They looked at the covenant and saw chains. Led by a charismatic vampire lord named Valdis the Unbound, they began to whisper of a different world. A world where vampires didn't serve humanity but ruled it. Where blood was taken, not given. Where their immortal superiority was recognized as natural law. The hunter families, human bloodlines blessed with ancient magic specifically designed to keep vampires in check, stood against them. They called for the covenant to be upheld. They demanded justice. So Valdis and his followers decided to send a message. The Crimson Purge began on a night much like this one, cold and moonless, perfect for slaughter. Vampire assassins swept through the hunter strongholds simultaneously, moving too fast for defenses to organize, too ruthless for mercy to matter. They killed men, women, elderly, warriors, innocents. But the children were the message. Celine watched, her hand pressed to her mouth in horror, as the memory showed a courtyard filled with hunter children, no more than 50 of them, ranging from infants to adolescents. They were herded together, surrounded by vampires who wore the crimson sashes of the newly formed Covenant Guard. This is what happens, Memory Valdis announced to the assembled vampire lords, when mortals forget their place. This is the price of rebellion. Then the feeding began. Celine turned away, bile rising in her throat. Even in memory the screams were unbearable. When she forced herself to look again, the courtyard was silent. Empty. Nothing remained but blood-soaked stone and the satisfaction on the vampires' faces. The hunters who survived went into hiding, Elder Marius said, his voice devoid of emotion as the images faded. We told the human world that they had attempted a coup, that the purge was justice. Most humans believed us, or were too terrified to question. And so the first covenant died, replaced by the system we have today. A system that has brought us 3 centuries of prosperity and power. Kale had fallen to his knees when Cassandra released him, but now he struggled upright again. Tears streamed down his face, tears of rage and grief for ancestors he'd never known, for children whose names had been passed down through generations as a reminder of what his family had lost. Prosperity, he spat, his voice breaking. You call this prosperity? You've turned humanity into livestock. You've built your empire on the bones of innocence. And you dare, his voice rose to a shout, you dare to call my bloodline the threat. Celine couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything she'd believed, every principle she'd been taught, was crumbling around her. She looked at the council, these ancient, powerful beings she'd revered her entire existence, and saw them clearly for the first time. Monsters. Not because they were vampires, but because they had chosen to become monsters. Kale, she whispered, turning to him, why didn't you tell me? He met her eyes and the pain there nearly broke her. Would you have believed me? Would you have listened to a human claiming your entire history was a lie? He shook his head slowly. I had to show you. I had to let you see with your own eyes what they were willing to do to keep their secret buried. Touching, Elder Marius said, his voice dripping with venom. But ultimately pointless. Now you both know the truth, and now you both must die with it. He raised his hand, and the shadows in the chamber began to coalesce, forming shapes that resembled wolves made of pure darkness. No one can know. The stability of our entire civilization depends on the myth of human betrayal. If word spread that we were the aggressors, that the covenant was broken by our hand, he shook his head. I will not see centuries of work undone by a meddling child and her pet human. The shadow wolves began to advance, their eyes glowing red with hunger. Around them, the other council members added their power to the attack. Cassandra summoning chains of ice, another elder calling forth a storm of razor-sharp blood crystals. Celine felt Kale move to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. His touch was warm, so impossibly warm against her cold skin. Human. Mortal. Fragile. And worth fighting for. Kale, she said softly, squeezing his hand. Do you trust me? He laughed, actually laughed in the face of certain death. With my life. With my soul. With everything I am. Celine smiled, and it was a terrible, beautiful thing. Then hold on tight. Her wings flared outward and power exploded from her core. The power that erupted from Celine was unlike anything she'd ever channeled before. It wasn't just her own strength, 2 centuries of accumulated magic, of blood consumed and power refined. It was something older. Something that had been sleeping in her veins since birth, waiting for a moment desperate enough to awaken it. The Nightborn legacy. Her family line was ancient even by vampire standards, descended from one of the original 13 who had been transformed during the First Turning, that mythical moment when humanity and darkness first merged. The elders had always watched her family with suspicion, with barely concealed fear, because the Nightborn bloodline carried something that most vampires had lost over the centuries. Choice. The ability to remember what it meant to be human, to choose mercy over hunger, love over domination. It was why Celine had been able to see Kale as more than food, more than a pet. It was why she stood here now, power singing through her veins, prepared to fight the entire council rather than let them destroy the one person who had made her feel alive in 200 years of existence. The crimson energy surrounding her intensified, solidifying into a sphere of pure force that expanded outward with devastating speed. The shadow wolves struck it first and simply ceased to exist, their forms disintegrating like smoke in a hurricane. Cassandra's ice chains shattered before they could reach her. The blood crystals bounced harmlessly off the barrier, falling to the ground as ordinary glass. Elder Marius staggered back, genuine surprise crossing his ancient features. Impossible. You don't have the strength. Don't I? Celine's voice had changed, layered now with harmonics that made the very air vibrate. Her eyes blazed brighter, and for a moment, just a moment, the shadows cast by her wings looked less like bat wings and more like something divine. Something angelic. You've forgotten what the Nightborn are, old man. What we were created to be. She took a step forward, still holding Kale's hand, pulling him with her into the protection of her barrier. The sphere moved with her, an impenetrable shield that made the most powerful vampires in existence look suddenly, terrifyingly mortal. Guardians, she continued, her words falling like judgment. That's what we were in the beginning. Not conquerors. Not parasites. Guardians of the balance between worlds, between light and dark, between human and supernatural. The first covenant wasn't servitude, it was partnership. And my bloodline remembers. Elder Cassandra launched herself at the barrier with a shriek of rage, her hands transforming into claws capable of rending steel. She struck the crimson sphere with enough force to shatter a building. The barrier didn't even ripple. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The moment Cassandra's flesh touched Celine's power, images flooded the chamber, not projected memories like before, but a raw transmission of truth that every vampire present felt in their bones. They saw Cassandra as she had been during the purge. Saw her laughing as she drained a hunter child who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Saw the pleasure in her eyes as innocent life faded. The elder vampire stumbled back, her face twisted in shock and fury. How dare you? How dare I? Celine's power flared brighter. How dare you pretend to be civilized while carrying that stain on your soul? Her gaze swept across the council. How dare any of you sit in judgment when you've built your thrones on murdered children? One of the other elders, Lord Thorn, usually silent but deadly, spoke up. The past is past, Nightborn. What's done is done. We cannot change history, only manage the present. Manage? Kale's voice was hoarse but strong. Is that what you call it? You've spent 3 centuries enslaving humanity, erasing your crimes and calling it management. He looked at each council member in turn. My family has preserved every document, every witness account, every piece of evidence of what you did. We've been waiting for a chance to expose you, to force the truth into the light. And achieve what exactly? Elder Marius had regained his composure, his calculating mind already working through possibilities. Even if you could prove your claims, which you cannot, since you'll both be dead momentarily, what do you think would happen? Humanity would rise up against us? They've tried before. They've always failed. We are stronger, faster, immortal. They are meat that walks and talks. Celine felt Kale's hand tighten on hers, felt the rage and helplessness radiating from him. He'd spent his entire life preparing for this moment, only to realize that truth alone might not be enough. But Celine had been thinking, planning, and she'd realized something crucial. You're right, she said softly. Humans alone cannot defeat you. But I'm not proposing they fight alone. She released Kale's hand and stepped forward to the very edge of her barrier. When she spoke next, her voice carried through the chamber with supernatural clarity, amplified by her power until every vampire in the citadel could hear her words. I am Celine Nightborn, last daughter of the first 13 bloodlines. I stand here today having learned that our council, our leaders, built their power on the broken bones of children. They murdered innocents. They betrayed a sacred covenant. They have lied to us for 300 years. Somewhere in the citadel, she heard doors opening. Heard footsteps as other vampires began making their way toward the chamber, drawn by the spectacle and the raw power radiating from her. I reject their authority, Celine continued, her voice unwavering. I reject their lies. And I challenge the Crimson Covenant itself. Not because I hate what I am, but because I remember what we were supposed to be. Elder Marius's face had gone pale with fury. You would start a civil war? You would tear apart our society over one human? No, Celine turned to look at Kale and her expression softened. Not over one human. For the possibility of what we could be again. For the chance to rebuild what was broken. For the right to choose our own path instead of following one built on atrocity. The chamber was filling now with vampires drawn by the commotion. Young and old, powerful and newly turned, they crowded into the galleries and doorways, watching this impossible confrontation unfold. Celine could feel their confusion, their curiosity, their fear. She could also feel something else, a spark of recognition in some of them. A memory of stories passed down through their own bloodlines, tales of a time before the tyranny, before the endless hunger, before they had become the monsters humans believed them to be. Look at them, Marius, Celine said, gesturing to the gathered crowd. Look at our people and ask yourself, do they know what you did? Do they know that our power was purchased with innocent blood? Or have you kept them in darkness all these years, feeding them the same lies you fed me? A young vampire near the front, a girl who couldn't have been turned more than a decade ago, spoke up hesitantly. Is it true? Did the council really murder children? Silence. Cassandra shrieked, but it was too late. The question had been asked, and now others were murmuring, wondering, doubting. Kale moved to stand beside Celine again, and though he swayed with exhaustion and blood loss, his voice rang clear. The Hunter families kept records. Names, dates, locations. We have testimony from vampires who refused to participate in the purge and went into exile rather than be part of the massacre. We have the original covenant documents, bearing the seals of both human and vampire leaders. We have proof. Proof that will die with you, Elder Marius snarled. He raised both hands and the other council members did the same. The air in the chamber began to crackle with gathered power, centuries of accumulated magic focusing into a single devastating strike. I will not let one foolish girl and her pet destroy everything we've built. Council, end this. Now. The combined power of the 7 elders descended like a hammer of the gods. Celine's barrier shattered like glass. She felt Kale's arms wrap around her as they both stumbled, felt his warmth against her as the killing blow descended. In that frozen moment time seemed to slow. She could see every detail with painful clarity, the triumph in Marius's eyes, the fear on the faces of the younger vampires, the ancient stones of the hall bearing witness to yet another atrocity. She had failed. They would both die and the truth would be buried once more. But then something impossible happened. The attack simply stopped. Celine looked up through a haze of pain and confusion to see a figure standing between them and the council. A vampire she'd never seen before, tall and elegant, with hair like spun gold and eyes that held the weight of millennia. He wore robes of pure white, and his mere presence seemed to drain the violence from the air. "Elder Lucian," Marius whispered, and there was genuine fear in his voice now. "You cannot be here. You swore an oath never to interfere in council matters." The newcomer smiled sadly. "I swore an oath to uphold the first covenant, Marius. An oath you broke the night you let Valdis the Unbound commit genocide." His voice was gentle but carried absolute authority. "I have watched in exile for 3 centuries hoping you would find your way back to the path. But I see now that some sins run too deep for redemption." He turned to look at Celine and Kale, and his ancient eyes held something like hope. "I am Lucian Dawnseeker, first among the 13 who accepted the dark gift. I was there when the covenant was forged, when humans and vampires first chose cooperation over conflict." He extended his hand to them. "And I am here now to ensure that their sacrifice, and yours, was not in vain." The entire chamber held its breath. The appearance of Lucian Dawnseeker changed everything. Even Elder Marius, ancient and powerful and ruthless beyond measure, could not hide his shock at seeing the legendary first vampire standing before them. According to every historical record, Lucian had vanished after the purge, disappearing so completely that most assumed he'd met final death rather than witness what his creation had become. But here he stood, very much alive, radiating a power that made even the council look like children playing at authority. "This is impossible," Cassandra breathed, taking an involuntary step backward. "You're a myth. A legend. You can't be real." Lucian's smile was tinged with sorrow. "I have heard that before from others who wished me gone. But I am very real, Cassandra Bloodthorn, and I remember every sin you've committed since your turning 500 years ago, including the pleasure you took in the purge." The watching vampires murmured in confusion and horror, the name "the purge" spreading through the crowd like poison. Those who had never heard the term looked to their elders for explanation. Those few who knew looked at the council with dawning revulsion. Elder Marius recovered his composure with visible effort. "You have no authority here, Lucian. You abdicated your position when you abandoned us. The covenant you speak of was a failed experiment, a weakness that nearly destroyed our kind. We did what was necessary to survive." "Necessary?" Lucian's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the softness. "Tell me, Marius, how was the murder of children necessary? How did draining infants ensure our survival? What possible threat did a 7-year-old girl pose to our kind?" The council leader opened his mouth, then closed it again. Around them, the gathered vampires were growing restless. Celine could sense their confusion transforming into anger as they began to grasp the implications of what was being discussed. Kale, still leaning heavily against Celine, spoke up. "He can't answer because there is no answer. The purge wasn't about survival, it was about sending a message. About breaking the will of the hunter families. About proving that vampires could do whatever they wanted without consequence. The hunters were planning to overthrow us." Lord Thorn finally found his voice. "We had intelligence that they were developing weapons, gathering forces." "Lies." Lucian's single word cut through the excuse like a blade. "I was there, Thorn. I saw the intelligence you claimed to have. It was fabricated, manufactured by Valdis and his inner circle to justify what they wanted to do anyway." He moved forward, his white robes seeming to glow with their own light. "The truth is far simpler and far more damning. The hunters were calling for a council, a joint meeting between human and vampire leaders to address concerns about the changing attitudes in our community. They wanted dialogue. Valdis gave them death." He turned to address the crowd now, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "I was the first to accept the dark gift from the Ancient One who created our kind. I was there when we discovered that human blood sustained us, when we realized we could live forever if we fed carefully and with consent. I helped forge the first covenant because I believed we could be better than the mindless monsters of legend. That we could use our gifts to protect humanity, not prey upon it. Celine watched in awe as the legendary vampire paced the chamber, his every word dismantling centuries of propaganda. For 1,000 years it worked, Lucian continued. We were guardians, protectors. Humans came to us willingly, offering their blood in exchange for our protection against the true horrors that stalked their world. We had purpose beyond mere survival. We had meaning. He stopped, his ancient eyes distant with memory. Then came the generation who knew nothing but comfort. Who had never faced true hunger or genuine threat. Who looked at our arrangement and saw only inequality, vampires serving humans as they chose to perceive it. Valdis the Unbound became their champion, whispering promises of dominion and power. He was strong, Elder Cassandra said defensively. He united the clans. He was a monster, Lucian interrupted coldly. And you followed him willingly because he gave you permission to indulge your darkest impulses. The purge was not a necessary evil, it was murder for the sake of establishing dominance. And when it was done, when the blood of innocence stained your hands, you constructed an elaborate lie to justify it. You rewrote history, burned documents, executed witnesses. You built the Crimson Covenant on a foundation of genocide and called it civilization. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Even the ever-present wind seemed to have stopped, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A vampire Celine recognized, Marcus Ironblood, a warrior of considerable renown, stepped forward from the crowd. His face was troubled, conflicted. Elder Lucian, if what you say is true, if the council has lied to us for centuries, what would you have us do? We cannot unmake history. The children are dead. The covenant is broken. We are what we are. Are we? Celine found her voice, stepping forward to stand beside Lucian. The legendary vampire nodded his approval, and she felt a surge of confidence. I was taught that vampires are superior to humans in every way. That our nature demands we dominate and feed. That mercy is weakness and attachment is death. She looked at Kale and her expression softened. Then I met him. A human who showed me more courage, more strength, more genuine honor than I've seen in 2 centuries of vampire society. He knew what I was, knew I could kill him with a thought, and still he chose to trust me. To teach me. To. She paused, struggling with words that felt too vulnerable, too honest for this harsh place. To love me, she finished quietly. Despite everything I am. Despite the monster I could become. He saw something in me worth caring for. And in doing so he showed me that we have a choice. Kale reached out, taking her hand again. His touch was warm against her cold skin. A reminder that they were different, yes, but not incompatible. Not enemies. The Hunter bloodlines don't want war, he said, his voice rough but steady. We never did. My ancestors went into hiding because fighting was pointless. You're stronger, faster, nearly unkillable. We couldn't win through force. So we preserved the truth instead, waiting for a moment when it might matter. When someone might listen. He looked around at the assembled vampires, meeting their eyes without fear. You're not all monsters. Some of you are just people who've been lied to, manipulated into accepting a system that benefits your elders while keeping you in darkness. But now you know. Now you have to choose. Do you continue following leaders who built their power on the corpses of children? Or do you try to build something better? Elder Marius laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Pretty words, human. But meaningless. Even if every vampire in this room believed your story, even if they all turned against us, what then? We return to the covenant? Become servants to humanity again? Beg for the blood we could simply take? You would be partners? Lucian said firmly. Equals. The covenant was never about servitude, Marius, it was about mutual benefit. Humanity needed protection from supernatural threats they couldn't comprehend. We needed sustenance provided willingly, which is far more nourishing than blood taken by force. He moved to stand beside Celine and Kale, creating a united front. But more than that, we needed purpose. Without it, we are parasites. Eternal, powerful, and utterly hollow. A female vampire in the crowd, young, perhaps only 50 years turned, spoke up hesitantly. I remember, my sire told me stories before he died. About the old days. He said blood given freely tasted different. Sweeter. He said he missed it. Mine too, another vampire added. She said the endless hunting, the constant fear of discovery, the need to hide what we are. She said it wasn't always like this. Murmurs of agreement spread through the chamber. Not everyone. Many of the older vampires who had participated in the purge looked furious and defiant. But the younger ones, those who had been born into the current system without knowing its origins, were listening. Elder Marius saw his control slipping and played his final card. Enough. His power exploded outward, and suddenly every vampire in the chamber felt it, the weight of his age and authority pressing down on them like a physical force. I'm done with debate. Done with your treachery, Lucian. Done with this human pet and his foolish protector. Darkness gathered around him, shadows deepening until he seemed to be standing at the center of an abyss. I invoke the right of dominion. As eldest among the council, as architect of the Crimson Covenant, I claim authority over all present. Kneel or be destroyed. The right of dominion. Selene had heard of it, an ancient law that gave the most powerful vampire absolute authority in times of crisis. It was meant to prevent civil war by establishing clear hierarchy. But it had rarely been invoked, and never in her lifetime. Around her, she felt vampires beginning to sink to their knees. Not willingly, their bodies were responding to Marius's power, to the weight of his will pressing down on them. Even Marcus Ironblood, strong and proud, was struggling against the compulsion. Selene felt it too. Felt her knees beginning to bend, her will being crushed beneath centuries of accumulated power. She was strong, yes. The Nightborn bloodline gave her advantages. But she was still young by vampire standards, and Marius was ancient. She would not be able to resist. Then Cale did something that would be spoken of in vampire lore for centuries to come. He stepped forward, moving past Selene, walking directly toward Elder Marius. The hunter runes on his skin blazed like golden fire, and his eyes, his beautifully mortal storm-gray eyes, held no fear whatsoever. I reject your dominion, he said clearly. I am human. I am free. And I do not kneel. The defiance in Cale's voice broke something in the room. It wasn't just his words, it was what they represented. A human, mortal and fragile, standing before an ancient vampire radiating enough power to level a city, and refusing to bow. Refusing to accept that might made right. Refusing to acknowledge that his life meant less simply because it would be shorter. The golden runes covering his body flared brighter, and Selene realized they weren't just decorative. They were a ward, ancient magic woven into his very bloodline, specifically designed to resist vampire compulsion. The hunters had known they would need protection against mental domination, so they built it into their children's children's children, a legacy of resistance passed down through 12 generations. Cale couldn't be forced to kneel, and his defiance gave others strength. Lucian straightened, his white robes billowing with renewed power. I too reject your dominion, Marius. You have no authority over me, I am your elder in truth and in spirit, and I do not recognize the legitimacy of a covenant forged in innocent blood. Selene felt the pressure on her lessen as Lucian's power countered Marius's. She stood tall, her wings spreading wide. I am Selene Nightborn and I refuse your dominion. I choose my own path. One by one, other vampires began to rise. Marcus Ironblood stood, his jaw set with determination. I am no one's puppet. I refuse. The young female vampire who had spoken earlier climbed to her feet, trembling but defiant. I didn't become immortal to spend eternity following tyrants. I refuse. More voices joined the chorus. Not all, perhaps not even most. Many vampires remained kneeling, either unable or unwilling to resist. But enough stood that Elder Marius's absolute control was broken. His face contorted with rage. You dare? You dare. The darkness around him intensified, becoming almost solid, a cloak of pure shadow that seemed to devour the light itself. I have lived for 1,000 years. I watched empires rise and fall. I am power incarnate, and you think you can defy me? You are old, Lucian said calmly. But age is not wisdom, Marius. You have lived 1,000 years and learned nothing but how to take. how to dominate, how to justify cruelty with necessity. He moved forward, and despite his gentle appearance, there was something terrible in his presence now, the weight of true authority. I'm older still. And I say your time is done. What happened next would be debated by scholars for decades. Elder Marius attacked with everything he had, 1,000 years of accumulated power, dark magic refined and concentrated into a single devastating strike. The shadows around him became spears, became chains, became a tsunami of pure darkness that rushed forward to consume everyone who had dared stand against him. Lucian raised one hand, and spoke a single word in a language that predated human civilization. Light exploded through the chamber. Not the cold blue of moonlight or the crimson glow of vampire magic. True light, warm and golden and utterly anathema to everything vampires were supposed to be. It poured from Lucian's palm like dawn breaking over the world's edge, and where it touched Marius's darkness, the shadows simply ceased to exist. Celine shielded her eyes, feeling the light wash over her. It should have burned. Everything she'd ever been taught said that such pure radiance would be agony to vampire flesh. Instead, it felt like coming home. Like remembering something she'd forgotten. Like the moment before her turning, when she'd been mortal and warm and the sun had been a friend rather than an enemy. The light faded, leaving afterimages dancing in her vision. When she could see clearly again, Elder Marius was on his knees. He wasn't dead, Lucian's strike had been precisely controlled. But he was diminished. The darkness that had surrounded him was gone, burned away, leaving only an old vampire who suddenly looked exactly as ancient as he truly was. His face was haggard, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling with the realization that he had just been utterly, completely defeated. How, he whispered. How can you still wield the first light? We are creatures of darkness. The sun is our enemy. We cannot. You cannot, Lucian corrected gently, because you have forgotten what you were. You have embraced the darkness so completely that you've become unable to touch the light. But I remember. He looked around at the assembled vampires, at the mixture of awe and fear on their faces. We were not always creatures of pure night. In the beginning, before the covenant was broken, we walked in twilight, beings of both shadow and light, balanced between two worlds. That was our gift and our curse. But when Valdis led the purge, when you chose genocide over honor, you cut yourselves off from half of your own nature. He moved through the chamber and vampires instinctively stepped back, giving him room. You condemned yourselves to eternal darkness, eternal hiding, eternal hunger. And you told yourselves it was freedom, that it was power. But look at what you've become, skulking in shadows, feared and hated by the world, with no purpose beyond survival. Is this truly better than what we had? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Kale, still standing tall despite his wounds, turned to address the crowd. The Hunter families remember the covenant. We've preserved the rituals, the ceremonies, the sacred words that bound our peoples together. It's not too late. We could rebuild it. Not exactly as it was. 300 years have changed both our societies. But something new. Something better. A true partnership, with protections for both sides, with respect and dignity for all. And what of those who don't want your precious covenant? Elder Cassandra spat from her throne. She hadn't attacked, hadn't defended Marius, but her position was clear. What of vampires who prefer to hunt? Who enjoy the kill? Will you force us to change? Celine stepped forward, surprising herself with her own boldness. No one will be forced. But those who choose to hunt humans, who choose to kill and terrorize and feed without consent, they will be held accountable. By their own kind. She looked around at the gathered vampires. We've hidden behind the excuse that this is our nature for too long. We have minds. We have will. We can choose to be better than our hunger. She's right, Marcus Ironblood said, his deep voice carrying authority. I've spent 3 centuries fighting, killing, taking what I wanted because I could. And I'm tired. He looked at his hands as if seeing them clearly for the first time. I'm so damn tired of being a monster. If there's another way, if there's a path that doesn't end with me being hunted by mobs or living in constant fear of discovery, then I want to try it. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Not universal. Some vampires looked horrified by the idea of giving up their power, of submitting to any kind of restraint. But others seemed almost relieved, as if they'd been waiting for permission to be something other than predators. Elder Marius looked up from his knees, and there was genuine incomprehension in his ancient eyes. You would give up everything. Everything we've built. Everything we are. For what? For humans who will fear us anyway? For a fantasy of cooperation that died 300 years ago. Lucian crouched down to meet his gaze, and despite everything, there was pity in his expression. No, old friend. We give up what you built, a pyramid of lies with corpses for foundations. We give up fear and domination and endless, pointless hunger. And in exchange we reclaim what we were always meant to be. Protectors. Guardians. Bridges between the mortal world and the darkness beyond. He stood and addressed the entire assembly. I cannot force this choice upon you. Each vampire here must decide for themselves what path they will walk. But know this, the Crimson Covenant is finished. It died the moment Marius fell. What comes next is up to all of you. What about the council? Someone called from the crowd. What happens to them? Lucian looked at the 7 thrones, at the elders who had ruled with iron cruelty for 3 centuries. Marius was still on his knees. Cassandra looked defiant but frightened. The others seemed to be calculating their odds of survival. That, Lucian said quietly, is not for me alone to decide. They committed crimes against both vampires and humans. Perhaps it's fitting that both should have a say in their judgment. He turned to Kale, who was swaying now, his strength finally failing. Celine moved quickly to support him, wrapping her arm around his waist. The human looked at Lucian with eyes that held both gratitude and exhaustion. What would you have done with them? The ancient vampire asked. If the choice were yours alone? Kale was quiet for a long moment, and Celine could feel the tension in his body. She knew what his family had suffered. Knew that every instinct probably screamed for vengeance, for blood, for payment in pain for the children who had been murdered. Trial, he finally said. Not revenge. Not execution. A trial with witnesses and evidence and a chance for them to defend themselves, if they can. Let the truth be spoken aloud, let all vampires hear what was done in their name. And then let judgment fall based on law, not rage. They don't deserve mercy, Celine said softly, though she made no move to release him. No, Kale agreed. They don't. But we deserve to be better than they are. We deserve to build a new system on justice, not vengeance. Otherwise, he looked up at her, and his eyes held a depth of understanding that stole her breath. Otherwise we're just replacing one tyranny with another. Celine stared at him. This human who should have been her prey, who had become her partner, who showed more wisdom in his handful of mortal decades than most vampires learned in centuries. How had she ever thought humans were lesser? He speaks wisdom, Lucian said, and there was approval in his voice. Very well. The council will be held for trial. Their crimes will be documented, witnesses will testify, and judgment will be rendered by a jury of both vampire and human representatives. You cannot be serious, Elder Cassandra shrieked. Humans judging vampires? This is insanity. This is justice, Marcus Ironblood countered. He moved to stand guard near the council thrones, and several other warrior vampires joined him, not to attack but to ensure no one escaped. If we're to rebuild the covenant, it must be built on equality. That means accepting that we can be judged for our crimes, not hiding behind our power. Chaos erupted as vampires began arguing, debating, taking sides. Some called for immediate execution of the council. Others demanded they be released, that vampire affairs should remain vampire business. Still others, like Marcus, stood firm on the idea of a joint trial. Through it all, Celine held Kale, feeling his warmth against her, his heart beating steady and strong despite his wounds. He'd lost so much blood. He needed medical attention. He needed rest. But he stood beside her, refusing to leave, determined to see this through. We should get you somewhere safe, she murmured. You need. I need to finish this, he interrupted gently. I need to see it through. My family waited 12 generations for this moment. I'm not leaving until I'm sure it's real. Lucian had moved to the center of the chamber, his arms raised for quiet. Slowly the arguments died down and all eyes turned to him. This night has changed everything, he said. And the changes will not be easy. There will be those who resist, who cling to the old ways. There may yet be violence and death before we find our path. His gaze swept across the assembly, and his next words were firm as stone. But I tell you now, the age of hiding is over. The age of preying on humanity without consequence is done. We will step into the light, metaphorically if not literally, and we will prove that vampires can be more than monsters. How? The young female vampire asked. How do we even begin? Lucian smiled. We begin with a choice. With each vampire in this room deciding who they want to be. With acknowledging our past mistakes and committing to a better future. With extending a hand to humanity instead of fangs. He turned to Celine and Kale. And we begin with them. A vampire who chose love over loyalty to her kind. A human who chose truth over safety. They are the bridge upon which the new covenant can be built. Celine felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her and fought the urge to hide behind her wings. This was too much. She was just one vampire. Just a girl who had fallen in love and refused to let him be killed. She wasn't a leader. Wasn't a symbol. Wasn't. She's right, Kale said suddenly, and she realized she'd spoken her doubts aloud. He turned to face her, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that made her want to weep. You're just one vampire. But sometimes that's all it takes. One person choosing differently. One person saying no more. One person willing to fight for what's right even when it seems impossible. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and his smile was soft and sad and beautiful. You saved me. Not just tonight, but months ago when you chose to see me as a person instead of prey. You showed me that vampires can change. Can choose. Can love. His voice dropped to a whisper meant only for her. You gave me hope, Celine. Let me give it back to you. She kissed him then, in front of everyone, not caring about propriety or politics or the scandal of a vampire openly showing affection for a human. His lips were warm against hers, his heartbeat strong, his spirit unbreakable despite everything he'd endured. When they parted, the chamber was silent. Then someone started clapping. It was Marcus Ironblood, his massive hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause. About damn time vampires remembered what it felt like to care about something other than blood, he said gruffly. Others joined in, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Not everyone. Some vampires looked disgusted. Others simply confused. But enough applauded that the sound filled the ancient hall, echoing off stone walls that had witnessed so much death and finally, perhaps, were hearing the sound of something like hope. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity, debate, and cautious negotiation. Celine had never imagined herself as a political figure, yet somehow she'd become central to everything that was happening. Lucian had insisted. The new covenant needed to be represented by those who embodied its ideals. A vampire and a human who had chosen each other despite every law and custom that said they shouldn't. A living symbol of what cooperation could look like. She stood now in what had once been the council's private chambers, converted into a temporary headquarters for the transition committee. The room was crowded with both vampires and humans, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable mere weeks ago. The air was thick with tension, but it was productive tension, the friction of two groups learning to work together after centuries of predator and prey. Kale sat at the large table in the center. His wounds finally healed thanks to a combination of human medicine and carefully applied vampire blood. Celine had been terrified when he'd agreed to accept vampire healing. She'd heard stories of humans becoming addicted to vampire blood, or worse, having their minds twisted by it. But Lucian had supervised the process personally, using ancient techniques that healed without corrupting. The Eastern clans are refusing to participate, Marcus Ironblood reported, his finger tapping on a map spread across the table. They say the new covenant is suicide. They're gathering forces, preparing to fight if necessary. How many? Asked Elena Frost, a human representative from the resurrected hunter families. She was a stern woman in her 50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled back severely, and her eyes held the kind of hard-won wisdom that came from surviving in a world actively trying to kill you. 3 clans, roughly 400 vampires, Marcus replied. Mostly old ones who participated in the purge or benefited from it. They have everything to lose if the new system takes hold. Then they're a serious threat, Kale said, studying the map. 400 experienced vampire warriors could devastate human settlements before we could organize a defense. We need to address this. Military action? Asked another human representative, a young man named David who served as liaison to the human government that had been cautiously opening dialogue with the vampires. Absolutely not, Celine said firmly. The moment we use force to impose the covenant, we become exactly what we're trying to move away from. Tyranny wearing a different mask. Then what do you suggest? Elena asked, and there was no hostility in her voice, just genuine curiosity. We can't simply let them continue hunting humans. How many innocent people have to die while we're being principled? Was a fair question. Celine had wrestled with it herself during sleepless days, staring at the ceiling while Kale slept peacefully beside her. How did you build a better system without becoming authoritarian in the process? How did you protect the vulnerable without imposing your will on those who disagreed? We make an offer, Lucian said from his position by the window. The ancient vampire had been uncharacteristically quiet during the meeting, simply listening and observing. We send emissaries to the eastern clans. We explain what we're building. We show them proof that the new system can work. And we give them a choice, join willingly or be left behind as the world changes around them. And if they attack our emissaries? Marcus asked. Then we defend ourselves, Lucian replied. But we don't strike first. We don't become the aggressors. The old covenant failed because one side chose violence over dialogue. Let's not repeat that mistake. Celine found herself nodding. It felt right even if it was risky. They were trying to build something based on consent and cooperation, that had to extend even to those who opposed them. I'll go, she said suddenly, surprising herself. I'll be one of the emissaries to the eastern clans. Every head in the room turned toward her. Kale's expression was immediately concerned. Celine, that's necessary, she interrupted gently. They need to see that vampires who believe in the covenant aren't weak. That we're not betraying our nature, just choosing to express it differently. She looked around the table, meeting each gaze steadily. And frankly, I'm one of the few vampires young enough not to have participated in the worst of the old system, but old enough to have some credibility. They might actually listen. She has a point, Elena admitted reluctantly. Though I hate the idea of sending anyone into that situation unarmed. Who said anything about unarmed? Celine smiled and let just a hint of crimson glow enter her eyes. I'm a Nightborn. We didn't survive this long by being helpless. The debate continued for another hour, but eventually, it was decided. A delegation would travel to the eastern clans, Celine and Marcus representing the vampires, Elena and Kale representing humanity, and Lucian accompanying them as the ultimate authority figure. Kale cornered her after the meeting as she'd known he would. I don't like this, he said without preamble. They were in the small room they'd claimed as their own, barely more than a closet really, but it was private, and in a citadel full of political maneuvering and constant negotiation, privacy was worth more than space. I know, Celine replied, pulling him close. He came willingly, his arms wrapping around her waist, his head tucking under her chin. She loved how he fit against her, how his warmth soaked into her perpetually cool skin. But we both knew this wouldn't be easy, that there would be risks. Celine, these are vampires who built their entire existence on the old system. They have nothing to gain and everything to lose from what we're proposing. They'll see you as a traitor. Probably, she agreed calmly. But they need to hear this from another vampire. From someone who chose the covenant not because they were forced to, but because it's right. She pulled back enough to look at him. Besides, you'll be there. My human hunter keeping me honest. He smiled despite his worry. You're human. I like the sound of that. Mine, she confirmed and kissed him soundly. As I am yours. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, simply enjoying each other's presence. It still amazed her sometimes, that she could find such peace with someone so fundamentally different from herself. That his mortality didn't make him less, but rather made every moment with him more precious. Kale, she said softly, what happens when you grow old? When you're 60, 70, 80 and I still look like this? It was a question she'd been avoiding, but it hung between them like a shadow. What happens when I have to watch you die? His hands tightened on her waist. I don't know, he admitted. I've thought about it. About asking you to turn me to make me like you so we could have forever. But that would be giving up your humanity, Celine finished. Becoming the very thing your family has fought against for 12 generations. Not fought against, he corrected gently. Protected against. There's a difference. He cupped her face, making her meet his eyes. Vampires aren't evil, Celine. You've proven that. Lucian proved it long ago. It's the system that was corrupted, not the nature of what you are. Then you'd consider it? Becoming? I'd consider anything that lets me stay with you, Cale said fiercely. But not now. Not while we're building the covenant. It would send the wrong message, that humans need to become vampires to be equal. We need to prove first that we can work together as we are. Celine felt something tight in her chest loosen. She'd been so afraid he would reject the idea entirely, that she'd be facing an inevitable goodbye somewhere in the future. But this was hope. A possibility that they might have more than just decades. Besides, Cale added with a small smile, I'm only 26. Let's not plan my transformation just yet. I'd like to at least make it to 30 as a human. She laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy. When had she last laughed like this? Before meeting Cale, she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt light enough for laughter. Their moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Marcus's gravelly voice called through the wood. Sorry to interrupt, but Lucian wants to brief the delegation. We leave in an hour. An hour. Not much time to prepare for what might be a suicide mission. But as Celine gathered her weapons and pulled on her travel cloak, as she watched Cale do the same with quiet determination, she felt something she hadn't experienced in her 2 centuries of existence. Purpose. Real purpose beyond simple survival. Beyond the endless cycle of hunting and hiding. They were building something that mattered. Something that could reshape the world for both their species. And if she had to risk everything to make it happen, then so be it. The delegation assembled in the Citadel's main courtyard as the sun set. Lucian had arranged for human vehicles to take them part of the way, a gesture meant to show that vampires could adapt to human technology, could meet humanity on their terms. But for the final approach to the Eastern Clan's territory, they would go on foot, showing respect for vampire traditions. A small crowd had gathered to see them off. Young vampires who had embraced the new covenant with enthusiasm. Humans who were cautiously hopeful about this new era of cooperation. Even a few of the older vampires who remained skeptical but were willing to give it a chance. Quite the send-off, Elena muttered, adjusting the straps on her pack. She'd brought an arsenal of weapons, not to attack but as protection. No one had protested. In this new world they were building, humans had every right to defend themselves. They're invested, Cale observed. They want this to work as much as we do. They want to believe it can work, Lucian corrected. That's not quite the same thing. Belief is fragile. It needs to be constantly reinforced with evidence. He looked at each of them in turn. That's what we're providing tonight, evidence that dialogue is possible. That even the most resistant can be reached. And if they can't? Marcus asked bluntly. Then we've still tried, Lucian said simply. And that matters. History will remember that we extended a hand before we ever considered raising a fist. They set out as full darkness fell, moving through the city streets with purpose. Humans watched them pass, a strange group of vampires and humans traveling together, armed but not aggressive, determined but not hostile. Some humans fled at the sight of them. Others watched with cautious curiosity. It would take time, Celine knew. Centuries of fear and predation couldn't be erased in weeks. But every journey began with a single step, and they were taking those steps together. The Eastern Clan's territory began at the Old River, where abandoned factories and warehouses provided perfect shelter for vampires who didn't want to be found. As the delegation crossed the bridge, Celine felt the familiar prickle of vampire awareness. They were being watched. They know we're here, she said quietly. Good, Lucian replied. We're not trying to surprise them. Marcus, signal our intentions. The warrior vampire raised a white flag, an ancient symbol of parley that transcended species. For several long moments nothing happened. Then, from the shadows of the nearest warehouse, figures began to emerge. At least 50 vampires, possibly more, forming a loose semicircle around the delegation. They wore the traditional clothing of the old clans, dark leather and ceremonial armor, symbols of houses and bloodlines that stretched back centuries. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, and their faces were hard with suspicion and hostility. From the center of the group, an ancient vampire stepped forward. She wore a crown of twisted silver and bones, the mark of a clan matriarch. Her face was beautiful and terrible, preserved forever in the moment of her turning, and her eyes held the weight of at least 6 centuries. Lucian Dawnseeker, she said, her voice carrying across the space between them. You bring humans into our territory. You fly the traitor's flag. You dare come here and preach about covenants and cooperation. Her lip curled in disgust. Give me one reason I shouldn't kill you all where you stand. Lucian stepped forward calmly, unafraid. Because you're curious, Morgana Ashenblade. Because despite your anger, you want to know how I've convinced so many to follow this path. Because you remember me from the old days before the purge, and you know I don't make empty promises. Morgana's eyes narrowed. I remember you as weak. Too soft for the reality of our existence. You disappeared rather than accept that we are predators, and predators don't negotiate with prey. You're right, Lucian said, and his agreement clearly surprised her. Predators don't negotiate. But we are not merely predators, Morgana. We never were. We are intelligent, sentient beings capable of choice. Capable of being more than our hunger. Pretty words, Morgana sneered. But ultimately meaningless. You want to put us back in chains, serving humanity like trained pets. I want to offer you purpose, Lucian countered. Freedom without meaning is just another form of prison. You hunt, you feed, you hide from the sun, you watch centuries pass in an endless repetition of survival. Is that truly better than having a reason to exist? For the first time, something flickered in Morgana's expression, something that might have been doubt. And what reason would you give us? What purpose could possibly justify submitting to humans? Celine stepped forward before she could second-guess herself. The same purpose we had before. Protection. Guardianship. The world is full of threats that humans can't fight alone. Supernatural dangers that most of them don't even know exist. We could face those threats. Save lives. Make a difference. Morgana's attention snapped to her. Ah, the Nightborn girl who started all this. The one who fell in love with a human and condemned her own kind too, she gestured dismissively, whatever this is supposed to be. I didn't condemn anyone, Celine said firmly. I made a choice. As you can make a choice now. Join us in building something better or continue as you have been. But don't pretend you're happy with the current system. I can see it in your faces, the emptiness, the boredom. The sense that immortality without purpose is really just a very slow death. Several of the gathered vampires shifted uncomfortably. Apparently, her words had struck closer to home than she'd expected. Kale moved to stand beside Celine, and she saw Morgana's eyes narrow at the hunter runes visible on his neck. I know what your kind did to my ancestors, he said quietly. I know about the purge, about the children, about the blood and betrayal. I have every reason to hate you. To want revenge. Then why are you here? Morgana demanded. Because revenge would make me like you, Kale replied bluntly. And I choose to be better. My family preserved the truth for 12 generations, waiting for a chance to make things right. This is that chance. We can build a new covenant, one based on equality and consent and mutual benefit. Or we can continue the cycle of violence and hatred until one side exterminates the other. He met Morgana's gaze without flinching. Which would you prefer? An eternity of looking over your shoulder, or a future where you're valued for something more than your ability to kill? The silence that followed was profound. Morgana stared at them for what felt like an eternity. Then, to everyone's surprise, she laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound, more like glass breaking, but it was genuine. You have courage, I'll give you that. Coming here to our stronghold and lecturing us about purpose and meaning. She circled the delegation slowly, like a predator assessing prey. But courage without wisdom is just stupidity. You speak of cooperation, of equality. You have no idea what you're asking us to give up. Then tell us, Elena said sharply. The human woman had been quiet until now, but her voice carried authority. Explain it. Make us understand what's so valuable about the current system that it's worth continuing to traumatize and kill innocent people. Morgana stopped her circling and faced Elena directly. For a moment, Celine thought the ancient vampire might attack. But instead she simply looked tired. Power, Morgana said flatly. That's what you don't understand. For centuries, millennia in some cases, we've been the apex predators. We've shaped human history from the shadows. We've toppled kingdoms, ended dynasties, controlled the flow of information and power. We've been gods walking among mortals. And you want us to give that up? To become servants again? Not servants, Lucian interjected. Partners. Equals. You're right that we've wielded immense power. But to what end, Morgana? What have we actually accomplished with all that influence? We've survived. We've accumulated wealth and knowledge. But have we built anything? Created anything? Left any legacy beyond fear and bloodstains? He moved closer to her, and despite his gentle appearance, his presence was commanding. I was there at the beginning. I watched us receive the dark gift, and I believed, we all believed, that it came with responsibility. That our power was meant to be used to protect, not to dominate. When did we forget that? When did we decide that might made right? When humans tried to overthrow us, one of the other vampires in Morgana's group called out. When they developed weapons to kill us, when they organized hunts, when they made it clear that they saw us as monsters to be destroyed rather than allies to be honored. That's not what happened, Cale said, his voice steady but firm. The hunters didn't develop weapons until after the purge. Until after you murdered our children and broke the first covenant. We armed ourselves because we had to, because you gave us no choice. Lies? Another vampire hissed. Historical revisionism. We have records. Forged by Valdis the Unbound and his followers, Lucian interrupted. I was their child. I saw the truth before I went into exile. The hunters were calling for dialogue, for a renewal of the covenant bonds. Valdis used that as an excuse to claim they were planning rebellion. He manufactured evidence, twisted testimonies, created a justification for what he wanted to do anyway. And you can prove this? Morgana asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. The hunter families have preserved everything, Elena said. She pulled a slim tablet from her pack. Modern technology that looked jarringly out of place in this confrontation between supernatural beings. Letters, meeting minutes, eyewitness accounts from vampires who refused to participate in the purge. We've digitized it all. We can show you. She held out the tablet toward Morgana. The ancient vampire stared at it as if it might bite her, then slowly, cautiously took it. Her fingers swiped through documents, her eyes scanning text that contradicted everything she'd believed for centuries. The other vampires crowded around, trying to see over her shoulder. Celine watched as emotions played across their faces. Confusion, anger, doubt, and slowly, something that looked like horrified realization. This is impossible, one of them whispered. Elder Morgana, this says that Valdis himself ordered the assassination of vampire peacemakers. That he killed our own kind to prevent the covenant from being renewed. I know what it says, Morgana snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. She continued reading, her face growing paler with each document. Finally, she handed the tablet back to Elena with trembling hands. If this is true, if even half of this is true, then everything we've built is based on a lie. Not everything, Celine said gently. Your strength is real. Your culture, your achievements, the bonds between your clan members, those are real. Only the justification for how you've been living is false. You were told humans were the enemy, but they never were. Not until we made them so. So what do you expect us to do? Morgana demanded, and there was genuine uncertainty in her voice now. Just submit? Accept human authority? Become subordinate to a species we've dominated for centuries? No, Cale said firmly. We're not asking for dominance. The new covenant isn't about one species ruling another. It's about partnership, mutual benefit, checks and balances to prevent either side from abusing power. Marcus stepped forward, his massive form somehow non-threatening despite his obvious physical power. Look, I'm not good with words. I'm a warrior. I've been for 3 centuries. I know how to fight, how to kill, how to dominate through force. And I'm tired of it. He looked at his hands, scarred even though vampire healing should have erased every mark. These hands have taken hundreds of lives. Maybe thousands. And for what? So I could feel powerful? So I could tell myself I was superior? He met Morgana's eyes. The Nightborn girl is right. Immortality without purpose is just slow death. I want to use my strength for something that matters. I want to protect instead of prey. I want to look at these hands and see something other than weapons. His voice dropped. Don't you? Don't any of you want to be more than what Valdis made us? The silence that followed was different from before. Not hostile or tense, but contemplative. Celine could see vampires in Morgana's group exchanging glances, having silent conversations with their eyes. Finally, a younger vampire, probably only a century old, stepped forward. I do, she said quietly. I'm tired of hiding. Tired of being feared. Tired of knowing that my existence makes the world worse instead of better. She looked at Morgana. Mother, I know you've protected us. I know you've kept the clan strong through difficult centuries. But maybe it's time for a different kind of strength. Morgana's expression softened as she looked at her daughter. Serena. The world is changing, Serena continued. Humans are developing technology that could threaten us. They're beginning to organize to share information globally. How long before someone decides to launch a coordinated extermination campaign? How long before our secrecy becomes impossible to maintain? She gestured to the delegation. They're offering us a way forward. A chance to step out of the shadows without being destroyed. Can we really afford to reject that? Other vampires began to speak up, some in support, others in opposition. A debate erupted within Morgana's clan, the kind of honest discussion that probably hadn't happened in decades. Celine watched, hope blooming in her chest. This was working. They were actually listening. Lucian caught her eye and smiled, a genuine expression of pride and approval. She felt Kale's hand slip into hers, his warm fingers intertwining with her cool ones. Together, they waited while the eastern clans argued about their future. It took hours. The moon crossed the sky above them while vampires debated the merits of isolation versus integration, traditional power versus purposeful existence, continued hunting versus willing blood donations. Some of the arguments grew heated, with vampires having to be physically restrained by their clan mates. But no one attacked the delegation. No one tried to kill the humans or execute the traitors. They talked. They argued. They questioned. And slowly, gradually, consensus began to form. As dawn approached, forcing the vampires to retreat to the shelter of the warehouses, Morgana approached Lucian one final time. We will not give you an answer today, she said formally. This decision is too important to rush. But, she paused and something in her ancient eyes had changed. We will send representatives to your council. We will examine this new covenant more closely. We will consider what you're offering. That's all we ask, Lucian replied with a small bow. Consider carefully. Debate thoroughly. Make the choice that's right for your people. And if we ultimately refuse? Morgana asked. If we decide that we prefer the old ways? Then you'll be left behind, Lucian said simply. The world is changing, Morgana. We can change with it, or we can cling to the past until it's pried from our cold, dead hands. But we cannot stop the change itself. Morgana nodded slowly. I will think on your words, Lucian Dawnseeker. And I will pray to whatever gods might still listen that we are wise enough to choose correctly. As the delegation made their way back toward the river, the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky, Celine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They hadn't won a complete victory, the eastern clans hadn't immediately agreed to join the new covenant. But they also hadn't been slaughtered, and that felt like a miracle in itself. Well, Marcus said with grim satisfaction, that went better than expected. No one died and we might have actually changed some minds. The beginning of wisdom is questioning what you believe to be true, Lucian observed. We've planted seeds tonight. Whether they grow will depend on factors beyond our control. Do you think they'll join us? Elena asked. Eventually, Lucian replied. Not immediately, perhaps. But Morgana is pragmatic. She'll see the writing on the wall, that the old system is unsustainable in the modern world. She'll come around. Kale squeezed Celine's hand. You were incredible, he said softly. The way you spoke to them with compassion but also strength. You made them see you as an equal, not a subordinate or a traitor. I just spoke the truth, Celine replied, though his praise warmed her. I told them what I've learned from you, that being different doesn't mean being lesser. That there's strength in choosing restraint over violence. They reached the citadel as the sun fully rose, forcing the vampires to retreat to interior chambers while the humans continued working. It was a strange division, working together yet still separated by biological necessity. But it was a start. Over the following months, the new covenant began to take shape. Representatives from human governments arrived to negotiate terms. Hunter families emerged from centuries of hiding to lend their expertise and historical knowledge. Vampires from across the world sent envoys to observe and report back. There were setbacks, of course. A vampire in the Western Territories killed 3 humans and had to be tracked down and executed, the first time in living memory that vampires had judged and punished one of their own for crimes against humanity. A group of human extremists attempted to bomb a vampire gathering, though they were stopped before casualties occurred. But for every setback there were victories. Blood banks began working with vampires to provide donated blood, freely given, properly compensated. Vampire scholars began teaching at human universities, sharing knowledge accumulated over centuries. Joint task forces were formed to hunt supernatural threats that had previously gone unchecked. The trial of the council elders became a media sensation. Held in a specially constructed chamber with both human and vampire observers, it lasted 3 weeks. Evidence was presented, documents, testimonies, even video footage captured by human survivors of various vampire attacks over the decades. The verdicts were mixed. Elder Marius, as the architect of the Crimson Covenant and primary orchestrator of the cover-up, was sentenced to permanent imprisonment in specially designed facility where he would remain in induced suspension, alive but unable to harm anyone. Elder Cassandra received the same sentence for her direct participation in the purge. Others received lesser punishments, centuries of community service, mandatory integration into human society under supervision, complete surrender of all accumulated wealth to reparations funds. It wasn't perfect justice. Nothing could truly compensate for the atrocities committed. But it was public, it was fair, and it sent a clear message. No one was above the law anymore. Not humans and not vampires. A year after that night in the council chamber, Celine stood in a very different kind of hall. The new Covenant Summit was being held in a converted opera house, a beautiful building that had been renovated to accommodate both vampire and human needs. There were no windows in the main chamber, but artificial lighting that mimicked daylight for human comfort while still being tolerable for vampire eyes. Temperature controls kept the room comfortable for both species. Tables were arranged to mix vampires and humans rather than segregating them. Celine wore formal attire, an elegant black gown that made her pale skin look luminous and her silver black hair shine like starlight. Her wings were fully visible, no longer something to hide but a symbol of what she was. Around her neck, she wore a pendant that Kale had given her, a small golden sun embracing a silver moon. Unity in difference. Kale stood beside her in his own formal wear, looking uncomfortable in the suit but devastatingly handsome nonetheless. His hunter runes were visible above his collar, no longer a secret or a threat, but a symbol of heritage and honor. They were about to sign the treaty that would officially establish the Second Covenant. Lucian stood at the podium, addressing the gathered crowd. 300 years ago we broke faith with each other. We chose fear over trust, dominance over partnership, isolation over unity. The cost of that choice was immeasurable. Lives lost, potential squandered, centuries spent in darkness both literal and figurative. He paused, letting his words sink in. Today we choose differently. We acknowledge the sins of our past. We commit to building a better future. We recognize that our differences make us stronger, not weaker. And we pledge, vampires and humans together, to honor this covenant as long as we exist. The crowd erupted in applause, not universal but widespread. There were still skeptics, still those who resisted change. But they were outnumbered now by those who had chosen to hope. Celine and Kale stepped forward together, along with other representatives from both species. One by one they signed the treaty, a document that had taken months to craft, full of protections and provisions and carefully negotiated compromises. When Celine's turn came, she took the offered pen and paused for just a moment. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The night she'd first met Cale and chosen to see him as a person rather than food. The confrontation with the council. The revelation of the purge. The slow, difficult work of building trust between species that had every reason to hate each other. She thought about her family line, the night-born legacy of guardians and protectors. She thought about the vampires who had come before her, who had tried to do right and been silenced or corrupted. She thought about the future she and Cale might have. Mortal or immortal, she didn't know yet, but together either way. Then she signed her name with a flourish. Cale signed next to her, his signature bold and clear. Their names sat side by side on the document. Vampire and human, united. The ceremony concluded with a celebration unlike any in history. Vampires and humans mingling freely, sharing drinks, blood wine for vampires, regular wine for humans, discussing art and philosophy and politics without the weight of predator-prey dynamics hanging over them. Celine found herself approached by Morgana Ashenblade, who had ultimately chosen to bring the Eastern clans into the Covenant. The ancient vampire looked years younger somehow, as if releasing centuries of anger and fear had physically lifted weight from her shoulders. "I wanted to apologize," Morgana said without preamble. "For my hostility when you first came to us. For my resistance. I was afraid. Afraid of change. Afraid of losing what little power and purpose I had." "You don't need to apologize," Celine replied gently. "Fear is natural. What matters is that you overcame it." Morgana smiled, a real smile that softened her terrible beauty into something almost warm. "My daughter tells me I should thank you personally. She says that you gave her hope when she had none. That your example showed her that vampires could choose to be better." "I only made a choice," Celine said. "The same choice available to all of us. To see beyond what we've been taught and imagine what we could be. A choice made simple by love," Morgana observed, glancing at Cale, who was deep in conversation with Marcus and Elena across the room. "Love makes fools of us all, but sometimes in the best possible ways." After Morgana departed, Lucian approached. The ancient vampire looked pleased, more relaxed than Celine had ever seen him. "You did well," he said simply. "Both of you. You were the catalyst for all of this. Never forget that." "It wasn't just us," Celine protested. "You were there. Marcus, Elena, all the others who chose to believe." "Yes," Lucian agreed. "But movements need symbols. Icons. Stories that people can point to and say, if they can do it, perhaps we can too." He placed a hand on her shoulder, a fatherly gesture that made her feel both young and ancient at once. "You and Cale are that story. The vampire and the human who chose each other despite everything. Live well, Celine Nightborn. Live so well that your story becomes legend." As the night wore on and the celebration continued, Celine and Cale slipped away to a balcony overlooking the city. Below them, they could see the lights of human civilization blending with the shadowed areas where vampires moved freely. Two worlds beginning to intertwine. "Do you think it will last?" Cale asked quietly, his arm around her waist. "The Covenant, I mean. Do you think we've actually changed things, or will it all fall apart in another few centuries?" Celine considered the question seriously. "I think it will be hard. There will be violations and conflicts and moments where it seems like we're sliding back into the old ways. But as long as there are people willing to fight for it, willing to choose cooperation over conflict, it will survive." She leaned into him, feeling his warmth against her side. "And we'll be among those fighting. For as long as we're able." "Together," Cale said, and it wasn't a question. "Together," Celine confirmed. "Always." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the world change beneath them. The moon rose higher, casting silver light across rooftops and streets. Somewhere in the city, a vampire and human were probably meeting for the first time without fear. Somewhere else, alliances were being forged and friendships formed. The Second Covenant was young, fragile, and would need constant tending to survive. But it existed. Against all odds, despite centuries of hatred and violence, they had built something new. And in that moment, with Cale's warmth beside her and hope spreading through the city like dawn, Celine allowed herself to believe that it would be enough. The university classroom was filled with an unusual mix of students, human and vampire, sitting side by side, taking notes as Professor Celine Nightborn lectured on the history of human-vampire relations. She looked exactly as she had 50 years earlier. Immortality had that advantage, though she'd learned to dress differently, to adopt mannerisms that made her seem approachable rather than threatening. Her wings were currently folded against her back, hidden beneath a specially designed jacket that accommodated them. The key thing to remember, she was saying, pacing in front of her attentive class, is that the first covenant failed not because cooperation was impossible, but because one side chose power over partnership. The lesson isn't that different species can't work together. It's that any system without accountability will eventually corrupt. A young human student raised his hand. Professor Nightborn, isn't it true that you were there when the council fell? That you're, personally part of the history you're teaching? Celine smiled. I prefer to think of it as having a unique perspective rather than being historical. Light laughter rippled through the classroom. But yes, I was present during the transition. Which is why I can tell you with absolute certainty that change is possible, no matter how entrenched the old systems seem. Another student, a vampire who had been turned only 5 years ago, spoke up. Do you ever regret it? Choosing the human, she caught herself. I mean choosing to oppose your own kind? I never opposed my own kind, Celine corrected gently. I opposed a system that was harming everyone, vampire and human alike. And no, I've never regretted that choice. Not even for a moment. The class ended, and students filed out, chattering about the assignment, arguing good-naturedly about historical interpretations, generally acting like students everywhere had acted for centuries. It still amazed Celine sometimes how normal it all seemed now. How completely the world had transformed in just 5 decades. She gathered her papers and headed out into the university courtyard. It was twilight, that golden hour when both vampires and humans could comfortably share the same spaces. The university had been designed with that in mind, with covered walkways and shaded areas to accommodate vampire faculty and students even during daylight hours. A familiar figure waited by the fountain at the courtyard center. Cale had aged. At 76, his hair was silver gray, his face lined with the marks of a life well lived. He moved a bit slower than he once had, though he was still in remarkably good health for a human of his years. He'd refused vampire blood for healing or life extension, said he wanted to experience aging naturally, wanted to understand mortality in a way most vampires never could. Celine's heart still skipped when she saw him, even after 50 years together. How was class? He asked as she approached, taking her hand in his. His fingers were spotted with age now, but his grip was still strong, still warm against her perpetual coolness. Good. The students are engaged, asking thoughtful questions. Though they all seem to think anyone over 100 is ancient history. Cale laughed. To them you probably are. 5 decades is a long time in human terms, even if it's barely a blink for you. They walked together through the campus, following a familiar path toward their home on the outskirts of the university grounds. Around them, the world had changed in ways that would have seemed miraculous during those desperate early days of the Second Covenant. Vampire-human couples were common now, though still complicated by the mortality issue. Joint research projects had led to breakthroughs in medicine, technology, and supernatural understanding. The Council of Balance, successor to both the old Vampire Council and the Human Hunter leadership, governed with representatives from both species, all subject to term limits and oversight. There were still problems, of course. Rogue vampires who refused to follow the Covenant. Human extremist groups who wanted all vampires exterminated. Cultural clashes and misunderstandings. But they were exceptions now, not the rule. The vast majority of both species had accepted the new normal and were working to make it better. I've been thinking, Cale said as they reached their house, a modest place surrounded by gardens that bloomed even in twilight. About what comes next. Celine felt a chill that had nothing to do with her cold blood. Cale? I'm not dying tomorrow, he said with gentle humor. But I'm 76. Realistically, I have maybe another decade, perhaps 2 if I'm lucky. We need to talk about it. They'd been avoiding this conversation for years. Decades really. But time had a way of making procrastination impossible. Inside they settled into their living room, a space that perfectly blended their two worlds. Modern human technology side by side with ancient vampire artifacts. Pictures on the walls showing their journey together, from that desperate night in the council chamber to university functions and diplomatic missions. A life, documented and preserved. I've decided, Cale said without preamble, that I want you to turn me, when the time comes. When I'm close to the end. Celine's hands trembled. You've been adamant for 50 years that you wanted to die human. That accepting vampirism would be betraying your ancestors. I was wrong, he said simply. My ancestors didn't fight against vampires, they fought against tyranny. Against injustice. They would approve of what we've built. And, his voice softened, I'm not ready to leave you. Not when we could have centuries more together. It's not an easy transition, Celine warned, though hope was blooming in her chest despite her caution. Especially for someone your age. Will be painful. Difficult. You'll have to relearn everything about how your body works. I know. Cale took her hands in his. I've been researching. Talking to people who were turned late in life. I understand the risks. But Celine, I've had a good human life. A full human life. I've experienced aging, seen the world change, understood mortality in ways you never can. But I don't want it to end. Not when there's so much more we could do together. Celine felt tears, something she'd thought she'd lost the ability to produce, threatening to spill. You're sure? Absolutely certain? Because once it's done. I'm sure. His storm-gray eyes held the same determination they'd had 50 years ago when he'd stood before the council. Turn me, Celine. Make me like you. Let us have forever together. The turning happened on a winter night, in the presence of Lucian and a few close friends who could help if complications arose. It was a private ceremony, sacred and intimate, nothing like the violent turnings of the old days. Celine held Cale as her venom entered his bloodstream, as his heart began to slow, as the transformation took hold. She whispered to him throughout, promises and encouragements and declarations of love. She told him about the world he would wake to, about the enhanced senses and strength, about the challenges and gifts of immortality. And 3 days later, when his eyes opened and blazed with new crimson light, when his aged body had been restored to the vigor of his prime years, when he looked at her with vampire awareness and still, somehow, completely human love, Celine knew they had made the right choice. Hello, Cale said, his voice deeper now, resonant with new power. I'm still me. Is that normal? Lucian, who had been monitoring the turning, laughed. Very normal. You're yourself, Cale. Just more. The essence remains. The humanity remains. You've simply added another dimension. Cale sat up slowly, testing his new body. His hair was still silver gray. The transformation preserved physical age appearance, though his body now had a vampire's strength and resilience. The lines on his face remained, but they looked different somehow. Distinguished rather than elderly. I can hear everything, he whispered in wonder. Every heartbeat in the building. Every breath. The blood moving through human veins downstairs. He paused, searching for words. It's beautiful and terrifying. It gets easier, Celine promised, taking his hand. The hunger will be manageable. We have ethical blood sources now, donated, compensated, completely consensual. You'll never have to hurt anyone. I can feel your emotions, Cale said, looking at her with new perception. Through touch. I can sense your love, your fear, your hope. Is this what you've been feeling all along? Vampires make bonds, Lucian explained. When two vampires are as close as you've become, a connection forms. Emotional resonance through physical contact. It's quite rare actually. Most vampire couples never achieve it. Cale's hand tightened on Celine's. Then we're lucky. The luckiest, she agreed and kissed him, her eternal partner, her human-turned-vampire, her bridge between worlds. 50 more years passed. The world continued to change. Technology advanced. Human and vampire cultures blended and evolved. New challenges arose, always new challenges, but they were faced together now with cooperation rather than conflict. Celine and Cale became legends in their own time. The vampire and the hunter who had changed history, who had proven that love could bridge even the deepest divides. They taught, they mediated disputes, they helped newly turned vampires adjust to their existence with compassion and wisdom. They stood together at ceremonies commemorating the purge victims, ensuring that history would never be forgotten or repeated. They advised the Council of Balance on matters of policy and ethics. They opened their home to troubled vampires and traumatized humans alike, offering sanctuary and understanding. And in quiet moments, in their garden under starlight or in their study surrounded by books from a dozen centuries, they simply existed together. Two beings who had chosen each other against all logic, against all tradition, against a world that said they couldn't work. On the 100th anniversary of the Second Covenant, they stood before a crowd of thousands, vampire and human, young and old, gathered to celebrate a century of unprecedented cooperation. "We are not perfect," Selene told the assembly, her voice amplified magically so all could hear. "We still struggle with prejudice and fear. We still make mistakes. We still have factions that resist unity. But we persist. We grow. We learn. And every year we become a little bit better at being the society we aspire to be." Kale spoke next, his transformed voice carrying the weight of both his human past and vampire present. "100 years ago, I was a mortal human standing in a vampire council chamber, terrified but determined to speak truth. Today I am vampire myself, but I carry my humanity with me still. That dual perspective has taught me something crucial. We are not so different, human and vampire. We all want purpose. We all want connection. We all want to matter." The Second Covenant recognizes that truth and builds upon it. They finished together, speaking in unison, to the next 100 years. To continued growth. To unity in diversity. To the covenant that binds us all. The crowd erupted in applause, a sound like thunder, like celebration, like hope made audible. That night, back in their home, Selene and Kale lay together in comfortable silence. Through their mate bond, emotions flowed between them, contentment, love, satisfaction at what they'd built together. "Do you ever wonder," Kale asked quietly, "what would have happened if I hadn't revealed my hunter heritage that night? If we just tried to run instead?" Selene considered. "We probably would have died. The council would have hunted us down. And the world would have continued as it was, trapped in cycles of violence and fear. So we made the right choice. We made the only choice we could live with." She turned to face him, her crimson eyes meeting his, twin pools of red in the darkness. "We chose truth over safety. Justice over survival. Love over fear. And yes, it was right. No regrets. Not a single one." They lay in silence for a while longer, two immortal beings who had found something precious in each other. Outside, the world slept and woke and changed as worlds do. Inside, they simply existed together. A vampire and her chosen mate, a human-turned-vampire and his eternal love, two people who had looked at an unjust world and decided to make it better. The story of Selene Nightborn and Kale the Hunter would be told for centuries to come. It would be taught in schools and sung in ballads. It would inspire others to make difficult choices, to stand against tyranny, to believe that change was possible even when it seemed impossible. But for them it was never a story or a legend. It was simply their life, complicated and beautiful, challenging and rewarding, shared together for all the long years of eternity. And in the end, isn't that what everyone truly wants? To find someone worth fighting for, worth changing for, worth building a better world for. To look at the person beside them and know, without doubt, that every choice that led to this moment was exactly right. They had that. Against all odds, despite every obstacle, in defiance of history and tradition and common sense, they had each other. And it was enough.